December 16, 1944, before dawn near Monschau, Germany. The frozen ground shivered as another wave of American shells tore through the air. Something was unmistakably different. The rounds did not thud into soil or burst in the treetops. They blossomed in the air above the attackers, spaced as if measured with a ruler, showering steel downward in a deadly curtain that no foxhole could defeat. Men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, pushing against the thin line of the 38th Cavalry Squadron, met a kind of fire that overturned every lesson they had learned about artillery and cover. What had once been predictable patterns and safe angles no longer applied. Death now came from above with an accuracy that felt mathematical. At that moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group, had already taken one of the most consequential unauthorized steps of the Ardennes campaign. Without clearance, in violation of standing restrictions, he ordered his batteries to load shells fitted with the Allies' most guarded secret, the proximity fuse. Each contained a miniature radar set that sensed the nearness of a target and triggered at the best height. The effect multiplied the killing power of artillery many times over. The calculation of casualties on winter battlefields was about to change. German soldiers could not know they had walked into a revolution. Operation Watch on the Rhine began with confidence. Hitler's final gamble massed roughly 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 guns behind the fog and pine of the Ardennes. He promised his generals that the blow would split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and reverse a war tilting toward defeat. At 05:30 on December 16th, a sudden bombardment along an 85-mile front achieved complete surprise. German guns roared at around 1,600 rounds per minute. American intelligence had missed the buildup. Units in the sector were either fresh replacements or worn-down veterans parked there for rest. Near Monschau, Axelson faced an impossible problem. The 38th Cavalry, a light recon outfit, was being overrun. Conventional time fuses could not break the assault. He chose to risk his career to save the line. He would answer later if he had to. The results were immediate. Assault columns that expected predictable ground bursts were struck by air bursts 30 to 50 feet overhead. Each burst threw a cone of fragments across a wide swath. Veterans who knew how to hug the earth were ripped apart in trenches, in cuts, behind trees, and in ditches. Nowhere felt safe. The proximity fuse was the meeting point of science and industry at full stride. Standard shells required impact or a clockwork setting that often burst too high or too low. This device carried its own tiny radio, no larger than a coffee can, packed with about 130 parts and 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on model, rugged enough to endure a launch force near 20,000 G. Upon firing, acceleration crushed a glass vial to activate a battery that powered the radar through flight. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory drove the work with a pace and secrecy comparable to the atomic program. The lab, outwardly an abandoned used car lot in Silver Spring, Maryland, at one point employed 3% of all American physicists. Security was severe. Workers spoke of nothing at home. Each fuse carried a tracked serial number. The hurdles seemed impossible. Radio tubes built for living rooms had to survive gun barrels. Electronics had to function while a shell spun at extreme rates in all weathers, at temperatures ranging from barrel heat to Arctic cold. They had to be sensitive enough to trigger near targets, yet not detonate early. Miniaturization solved the puzzle and later remade the electronics industry. Tubes refined by Dr. James Van Allen shrank to the size of pencil erasers, yet contained all needed elements. By December 1944, factories were turning out 40,000 fuses a day. More than 100 companies took part, from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crosley. The bill reached $1 billion wartime dollars, second only to the bomb. Axelson's first use sparked a command crisis. Proximity fuses had been restricted to anti-aircraft batteries to avoid capture and imitation, but the effect at Monschau could not be ignored. The attack stalled with loss rates that stunned both sides. Word raced upward. Eisenhower, watching the offensive widen, asked on December 19th for permission to release the fuse to field artillery. By December 21st, the restriction was lifted. Within days, the new ammunition flowed everywhere in the Bulge, a display of American logistics in motion. Units learned fast. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received its allotment as the ring tightened. The 420th Armored Field Artillery, with M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, used the shells to guard approaches from the northwest. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, a black unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with punishing effect southwest of the town. Observers discovered an unexpected bonus. Fine adjustments mattered less. The fuse found its own best burst height. Accuracy requirements eased while lethality rose. Bastogne became the case study. Surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne held the crossroads by grit and by guns. The 463rd, firing 75mm pack howitzers, logged 7,676 rounds between December 19th and 31. Supplies of the new fuse were limited, but whenever they appeared, the physical and mental shock was out of scale. On December 22nd, hours after General McAuliffe sent his single-word answer to a surrender demand, German infantry moved across open snow in formation. Airbursts patterned the fields overhead with clean geometry. Entire platoons disappeared in seconds. The 969th's 155s built an outer ring. The larger shells bursting around 50 feet covered still greater areas and broke assaults before they reached the American line. Prisoners later said units lost cohesion well short of contact. The Sauer River crossing near Echternach on the night of December 25-26 produced one of the clearest ledgers of the fuse's effect. Patton's Third Army, driving north to relieve Bastogne, caught a German battalion on the ice and in the dark. Traditional fire would have required careful bracketing. Proximity fuses needed far less tuning. Patton wrote that the new ammunition was devastating. There was nowhere to run, the river behind and our bursts above. When the fire lifted, he counted 702 bodies. It was one of the few tallies recorded by actual count. A battalion erased within minutes. The Ardennes forest, once a comfort to trained German woodsmen, turned vicious. In the open, a burst at 30 to 50 feet was terrible. Under trees, it was worse. Airbursts shredded branches into jagged projectiles. Splinters, as long as a forearm, scythed outward at extreme speed. Time-honored tricks failed. Hiding behind great trunks or tucking under roots meant nothing when fragments and wood came straight down. A single proximity-fused 155mm burst above the canopy could clear a space the size of a tennis court. Men tried spreading out. The wide, lethal area punished that, too. Bunching for support invited annihilation by a single round. Technically, the device worked on principles that sounded like fantasy to soldiers of the 1940s. Inside each fuse, a small transmitter in the VHF band pulsed energy and listened for echoes from ground, trunks, vehicles, and bodies. As the reflected signal grew to a calibrated threshold that equated to a best burst height, a circuit fired the detonator. All of this had to survive launch loads that would crush a human to paper. Shells spun fast enough to impose immense centrifugal force. Temperatures spanned barrel heat near 3,000 degrees to sub-zero chill near the top of the arc. Cushioning and strengthened elements protected the delicate tubes. Reliability exceeded 80%. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground fixed ideal burst heights. For 105mm divisional guns, it averaged 30 feet. For 155s, it was about 50. The rare 240mm rounds exceeded 70 and flattened entire grid squares. Studies showed 5 to 10 times the effectiveness of ordinary fuses and a vast increase in lethal area. Anti-aircraft units saw even sharper gains, with success against V-1 flying bombs leaping from roughly 17% to nearly 80% within weeks. German intelligence failed badly. During the December surge, German troops overran an American ammunition site and seized roughly 20,000 proximity-fused rounds. Analysts opened them, saw vacuum tubes, and dismissed the idea that such electronics could survive firing. Some proposed magnetism, others thought the visible parts were decoys. The blind spot had roots. Before the war, Germany had led research on similar devices. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had prototypes by 1940. Hitler's demand that no project take longer than 6 months to field killed the effort. Engineers could not accept that Americans had solved problems they had shelved. Later interrogation produced claims that German electrostatic fuses using capacitance shifts had reached 90+% reliability in trials. Had the project continued, Germany might have fielded them early in the war. Christmas Day brought no pause. Units trying to refit and resupply learned that the new weapon honored no holiday. Field kitchens, convoys, and staging areas were pounded without the need for observed fire. The 420th Armored Field Artillery alone fired over 1,000 rounds that day. Most used fuses. Their self-propelled M7 Priest howitzers poured shell after shell into the mist, each one detonating perfectly above its target. German units caught in the open were torn apart before they even understood what had changed. The advantage of bad weather, once a shield from Allied air power, vanished. Now artillery could deliver destruction at any hour, in any condition. For soldiers long used to moving safely under clouds or darkness, the realization was devastating. Fear seeped into every march, every bivouac, every whispered order. Death could come from a sky they couldn't even see. On December 21st, Otto Skorzany's elite commandos launched their attack on Malmedy. These men were Germany's best, the same who had rescued Mussolini and almost captured Tito. Disguised in American uniforms, they hoped to sow chaos behind Allied lines. But the deception proved useless. Axelson's batteries and others in the sector unleashed proximity-fused fire that shattered the attack. Shells burst above their heads as if guided by thought, scattering the commandos before they could advance. Survivors later spoke of the terror of invisible eyes in the sky. The assault collapsed completely. For the Waffen-SS, this failure was more than tactical, it was psychological. Their reputation for elite invincibility dissolved under the relentless precision of American gunnery. Some soldiers ran toward the enemy lines just to escape the bombardment, seeking death rather than enduring another barrage. Behind the battlefield, miracle stood an equally staggering industrial one. By late 1944, more than 100 American companies had converted to fuse production. Crosley Corporation stopped making refrigerators to assemble fuses. Emerson Radio retooled its factories, while RCA, Sylvania, and General Electric dedicated entire plants to the effort. Quality control reached new heights. Every component was inspected, every solder joint checked under magnification, random samples fired to ensure survival. Any flaw meant rejection. Most workers were women laboring 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, never told what their product truly did. They only knew it mattered. By December 1944, they were turning out one finished fuse every 2 seconds, day and night. Costs had fallen from over $700 apiece in 1942 to just $18. 22 million fuses would be built before the war's end, 200,000 used in the Ardennes alone. General George S. Patton grasped their value faster than anyone. His Third Army, racing north to relieve Bastogne, treated proximity fuses as a secret weapon of breakthrough. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, designed new tactics around them. One was the time-on-target strike. Multiple battalions firing from different locations so that all shells arrived together. When dozens of proximity-fused rounds burst simultaneously at perfect height, the result was beyond anything the enemy had seen. German troops called it the bell toll of death. Between December 22nd and 29, Patton's guns fired roughly 50,000 such shells. The devastation helped rip open the corridor to Bastogne. Patton later wrote with grim satisfaction, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Farther north, at Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held a critical stretch of high ground against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including Hitler's favorite formation, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Between December 17th and 19th, American artillery fired about 160,000 rounds, 40,000 of them fitted with proximity fuses. Those 1/4 of the shells caused more than half of all German casualties in the sector, roughly 5,000 in total. The mathematics of destruction could not be denied. The new fuse had effectively quadrupled U.S. firepower. Waves of German infantry and armor tried again and again to climb the wooded slopes, only to be erased by airbursts that turned trees into splinters and the sky into fire. The elite of the Waffen-SS, hardened veterans of every front, broke and fell back. The ridge never fell. Then came the skies. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive strike by 900 fighters against Allied airfields across Europe. The surprise was total. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were caught on the ground. Yet as German planes turned homeward, they met an invisible wall. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire filled the air. Of 277 German aircraft destroyed that day, 172 were confirmed killed by flak using the new fuse. The rate of success astonished both sides. German pilots, trained to jink and weave through predictable shell patterns, now found explosions tracking them wherever they flew. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding to death, never recovered from this final blow. By early January, secrecy could no longer be maintained. Too many soldiers had witnessed the airbursts. Too many shells had been fired. On January 6th, the U.S. War Department authorized limited disclosure. Newspapers like the New York Times hinted at a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns without revealing how. German intelligence finally grasped the truth, but too late. A report to the Foreign Armies West on January 10th admitted, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimum height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." After the war, even the German High Command acknowledged its impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt said simply, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, echoed him. "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veterans." Statistics bore them out. Around 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired during the Bulge, responsible for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, roughly a fifth of their total losses in the campaign. Lethality increased 5 to 10-fold compared to standard ammunition, and weather or darkness no longer offered protection. But behind those numbers lay unbearable human cost. German soldiers, many barely out of their teens, died in ways that defied understanding. They were killed by weapons that seemed to think, to find them wherever they hid. For the Americans, the moral burden fell on unseen shoulders, the factory workers who built these devices in silence. Accidents were hushed up, exhaustion ignored. Women at Crosley, Emerson, and RCA collapsed at their benches, never knowing they were helping win a war. They only learned afterward what their work had done. Still, the question remains, without the fuse, how many more Allied lives would have been lost? The Bulge cost the U.S. 19,000 dead, even with it. Without the weapon, the toll might have been far higher, and the war longer time enough for the Reich's atrocities to claim countless more. Each day the war was shortened by technology may have saved thousands from the camps. The legacy of the proximity fuse stretched far beyond victory. Its tiny vacuum tubes laid the groundwork for modern electronics. The manufacturing standards created for it became benchmarks for industry. Supply networks coordinating hundreds of companies prefigured modern logistics. Dr. James Van Allen, who had helped design the fuse's miniature tubes, later used his expertise in space research, discovering the radiation belts that bear his name. Radar principles refined for the fuse evolved into advanced sensors, while the concept of autonomous detonation, the idea that a weapon could decide when to act, became the seed of all guided munitions to come. Every smart bomb and missile that now strikes with precision traces its ancestry to those shells over the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces shattered and retreating. Hitler's last gamble had cost his army around 100,000 men and achieved nothing. The Allies suffered 75,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. Yet the outcome might have been different without a single officer's decision on a freezing December morning. Colonel Axelson's unauthorized order to use the secret fuse changed the battle, perhaps the war. Eisenhower later remarked that had Germany possessed the same weapon during the Normandy landings, D-Day might have been impossible. The proximity fuse was more than a technical innovation, it was a pivot in history. Those who faced it experienced something new in the story of war: intelligent destruction. To the men of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, it seemed as if the sky itself had turned against them, guided by unseen minds. From that moment on, warfare entered a new age, an age where technology, not numbers or courage, would decide the outcome. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the future had arrived. The mathematics of death had been rewritten by a radar pulse in a shell the size of a man's fist.